This is Unrendered on IKTV. I'm Tony Regisford, and I'm now joined by Mr. David Popo. He is the head of Social and Sustainable Development Unit within the OECS Secretariat Division. I am fortunate to have Elma remain with us through this segment, so she's already been introduced. Now, David, the whole idea of social development, if we want to just use that, we're talking about economic union. But of course, underpinning all of this, people, flesh and blood people, and they've got certain social development needs, and they have to be taken care of in terms of health, education, just to put those two out. How are we factoring all of this into the mix of what we're setting out as policies for the union and integration?
All right, thank you very much, Tony. I think you've really put it in a very nice way. We really cannot talk about an economic space, trying to ensure that we can facilitate the development in a very harmonized way, in a very integrated way in terms of economic development. But you know, as the saying goes, if you haven't got a healthy nation or well-informed, educated people, then that really compromises all your economic investments. We often hear in terms of the quality of our labor force, of our workforce. We know that, for example, increasingly because of our changing lifestyles, we have a number of non-communicable diseases like hypertension, diabetes, etc. So that within the economic union, it says that the member states have agreed to ensure that that they can develop some very sound, comprehensive social development policies. But policies that would be based upon empirical, not just ad hocish like we've had in the past, but empirically based social development policies. Policies that would address a number of social development issues that cut across the region. Poverty issues, gender equality, juvenile justice, the whole idea in terms of how do we safeguard and preserve our natural resources, which in itself can contribute optimally with respect to growth and development. And crime and violence among young people. So we have a plethora of social issues, and if they're not addressed in the context of, as we attempt to strengthen our competitiveness in the market, as we attempt to ensure that all the citizens enjoy a quality of life, then we will end up with a society which is where you have growth, but not necessarily in terms of stability and lots of dysfunctionalities. So that in a real sense, we're talking about addressing those sectors, but in the context of that economic space. Very, very critical.
If we're to just look at one of them, in as much as you bring out crime, and the reason I'm going to pop that up, because I'm sure one of the reservations people would have had with the free movement of people would be the exploitation of the criminal element. I mean, you know, countries sometimes see themselves as being more pure and secure than others, so they don't want to accept that they themselves are just as bad. You know, so if somebody is beginning to steal in a village, you'd say it's somebody from the other village. Now, crime is an issue across the Caribbean, the OECS being part of the Caribbean. It's an issue of high concern. People resolve conflict as well through violent means, and this seems to be a thing that becomes more and more prevalent as we go along. I'm sure you observe that in St. Lucia. I'm sure we observe it here in St. Vincent. What in the policies that you are putting in, your framework of policies that will address this, what have you done to start the conversation, and not to start the conversation, but to actually come up with solutions or ways of tackling crime, the spread of crime and violence, in a broad spectrum way with the OECS island states.
This is a very complex and a very compelling social situation in terms of how our governments have been trying to address the situation of youth and crime. I would not necessarily go into all the causative factors, but we know, for example, we have high levels of unemployment.
Yes.
In terms of our demographic profile within the OECS region, comprise basically young people between the ages of 0 up to 24 or 35, depending upon your age cohort. We have the whole situation in terms of people getting involved in gangs because of a lack of identity.
Yeah.
So the historical issues there in terms of lack of cultural identity, the changing patterns in terms of how households are involved in production, single parents having to work long hours, so kids are unsupervised, lack of discipline, etc., etc. But then it has to be addressed. So for example, I can give you one illustration in terms of how the member states are trying to harmonize with respect to policies as it relates to, for example, juveniles.
Yes.
Juveniles who come before the law, who are in contact with the law. As we move, within the space, within the economic space, you see a number of young persons from the age of between 8 and 14, adolescents, of a particular brain, a particular way of looking at the world, very impulsive, not necessarily to be seen as problems, as social problems, but as opportunities, because that's the future resource in terms of sustainable development.
Right.
But we see that given the fiscal the limited fiscal maneuvering of our member states, the allocation of resources in terms of ensuring that those young persons, can be effectively rehabilitated is in itself a challenge. It's one of our development challenges. So you have member states attempting things, for example, establishing juvenile centers, detention centers.
Right.
Sometimes the standards, are so not consistent with the international standards in terms of how do you reform, as it were, those young persons. So at the end of the day, they come back worse. They come back as hardened criminals.
So your role, what you lead in the charge for, basically, is to see how you can identify what are the right standards and harmonize that across the OECS region.
Right.
So you don't have people trying to replicate and not do the thing as well as another as another OECS state. Is that what you're saying?
I'll give you. I was going there. So, for example, you go into any of the centers or to some of the centers for young people, and it appears like a prison. So, even the way, for example, those detention centers are constructed.
Right.
In one or two instances, you have the beds, which are in concrete.
Right. So it's
young people.
It's an air of punishment. It's not really reforming.
It's a punitive approach as a policy.
Yeah.
Okay. So we are saying that can we have a situation where we can harmonize, in terms of policies for the rehabilitation of young offenders?
Right. So you look at that.
And that's the kind of work that's
the kind of work
that's
you're doing
done now. How do, for example, in terms of our service providers, how does a probation officer interact with a juvenile offender? The court system, how do magistrates, do they see it as a punitive measure?
Yes.
Or are there what they call diversion programs?
Yes.
Whereby those young persons can go into other diversion programs.
Yes.
For example, in the case of St. Vincent, Pan for Crime.
Right.
So you have those young persons who can be engaged in those kinds of activities, but working towards the rehabilitation of those young persons, so that they can come back into the society and become productive citizens.
And
that's just one example.
Yes.
Yes.
I know you would want to comment on this, but I'm also conscious of the fact that we're running hard on time here.
Yeah.
I want to throw out another question. Maybe Elma, you can chip in. The whole thing of health. My observation is that we are perhaps under-resourced to really, I'm talking about St. Vincent, to really produce a health facility that would deliver proper tertiary type of health service, not just primary health care, okay, but secondary, if there's such a thing as tertiary health care. I'm talking about equipment that you need to buy to do a CT scan, you know, or certain procedures. You know, these are expensive. When you look at economies of scale, you, you know, you spend millions of dollars for a population of 90,000. You know, it can't work. Is it beyond your remit within the whole OECS, you know, integration and economic union? Is it beyond your remit to start to look at how the OECS states can cooperate and harmonize in terms of how healthcare is delivered, so that resources are not replicated across the states?
I'll start and then let David, because I think you want to tie it back to the economic union. And Tony, with your permission, I want us to come back to the issue you raised before about the crime, because I think you mentioned you mentioned the relationship with free movement, and that's important for us to talk about. But with healthcare, you see the areas to which David referred, all of those social areas are as integral to the economic union as the other areas that we talk about, the economic ones. And so there really is nothing preventing the member states from agreeing on the areas in which they want to go with respect to that same harmonization that you spoke about and the policy convergence.
And certain centers of excellence.
Exactly.
So you know, at St. Lucia has the cardio-related sort of health care.
Yes.
You know, that's what develops the center of excellence there. Mind you, somebody who has that need in St. Vincent has to be managed until they can get to St. Lucia. That's understood as well. But yes, so go ahead, Elma.
That I was handing to David now, because I was saying to you that yes, we have the same kinds of obligation, and it really is for the member states to agree on where they want to go with the health program.
Yes.
Right, and based on that, I mean, I'll give you just one or two examples. Apart from the issue of, as you were saying, in terms of was it cancer or whatever it is, or
well, cardio, in this case. Yes.
We have at the Secretariat an HIV desk.
Right.
We also have as well for many years the pharmaceuticals, the OECS pharmaceuticals.
Right.
Where because of the pool.
Right. You can get the drugs cheaper.
Affordable drugs cheaper.
Right.
We now have what we call an e-registry in terms of, and procurement in terms of the purchasing of antiretroviral drugs.
Right.
So that if, for example, a family moves from St. Vincent to Antigua or to St. Lucia, you need not have a paper with you in terms of a referral system.
Right, so it's already on the system.
It's already on the system.
So
in terms of quick access, right, you can get that done in a couple of days.
Yes.
So these are some of the harmonized approaches in terms of healthcare.
And
Gina, I know you wanted to get back onto the issue of crime, and I'm going to give you like 1 minute because we're at the end of the segment.
30 seconds.
Yeah, so
30 seconds, because the crime is another area that comes up when we talk about free movement. And I just want to point to the fact that there are areas in which we anticipate that we can deal with them. One, Safia mentioned free movement in the program, in the segment with you. Free movement, but there is a limitation, so that if someone poses a security risk, then immigration is not obligated to allow them to enter and to move. Secondly, there is the possibility of ensuring that in the treaty, and we've put it in, member states can in fact agree to limit the movement if there is a problem, the movement of people. So you do have the possibility of saying, you know what, I cannot allow the free movement of people. Perhaps I don't have the facilities to deal with problems of crime. And then there is also the harmonization of border management systems. So we are ensuring that immigration can talk throughout the OECS.
Right.
And so we're looking even now at this issue of managing the movement of criminal elements.
Excellent. But when we come back, we'll be into the final segment of the program. I want to go back on a social issue which has to do with health, but health insurance now. In terms of, and I'm not even looking at it from a private sector standpoint, I'm looking at it from a standpoint of each member state having their national insurance service, of which is an element of health insurance. And are we thinking in terms of, if we get into this economic union, are we thinking in terms of somehow expanding the national insurance services, or consolidating, as it were, so that we have a bigger institution that can serve more people? Talking economies of scale here. So when we come back, we'll pick that up.
Right.
This is Unrendered on IKTV. When we come back from the break, we'll be into our final segment with our guests from the OECS Secretariat.